On the 17th day of the spring of the Great Edict, the skies over the capital of Virul were unsettlingly clear. Not a cloud drifted, not a bird stirred the air. Yet beneath that pristine blue, fear clung like smoke to every rooftop. Soldiers in blackened armor marched through the cobbled squares, unrolling golden sealed scrolls. And from every street corner, a voice rang out. As of today, all symbols of the one called the Redeemer are forbidden. Worship, prayer, or even the utterance of his name shall be deemed an act of treason. By order of King Alador, guardian of the kingdom's purity, the decree fell like a sword through the heart of the people. Crosses were torn from walls, scriptures were ripped from hidden shelves and burned in public fires. Within a single week, 37 sanctuaries were reduced to ash. What rose into the sky wasn't just smoke, it was the soul of a nation being erased. Elia, a quiet servant in the royal kitchens, stood beneath the wooden eaves, staring at the flames that devoured the grand chapel. It was where he had first heard the gospel of forgiveness, where he had once knelt and whispered his guilt into the silence. Now that silence burned with the ceiling beams. He did not cry, he did not speak, he only watched. Somewhere deep inside, a crack widened. Elia had always believed that God could not be banned. He wasn't in the walls or stained glass, after all. But as he saw holy places turned into dust and fear woven into daily greetings, he started to wonder if God was still here. Why hadn't he spoken? Inside the palace, whispers stirred behind closed doors. Mira, a young maid barely 17, knelt before the last painting of the crucifix. With a dull blade, she scraped away the nails in the Savior's hands. As her tears fell, they blurred the red paint. No one could tell anymore what was blood and what was grief. At the eastern gate, a silent procession stretched toward the forest. Dozens of men and women who'd been caught with scraps of scripture or tiny wooden crosses. There were no trials, only exile. They walked into the woods, and no one saw them again. Back within the walls, the most dangerous transformation was not the punishment, but the silence. Church bells no longer rang. Instead, brass horns sounded at the king's chosen hours. The sacred blessing, "May the Lord be with you," was replaced by peace from the king. Hugs after prayer became downward glances and swift departures. Everyone feared the king's eyes, men dressed in ash gray, silent observers who posed as bakers, merchants, beggars, listening for a single forbidden word. Christ. King Alador had not declared war with a sword. He chose something colder. He sought to erase the memory of a god he could not kill. And yet, beneath floorboards, in dark kitchens and secret cellars, the memory stirred. A few, like Elia, remembered the sound of hymns, the way hope once echoed in stone halls, the way, when no one else would listen, heaven still heard. But for now, God remained silent, or so it seemed, and the cross now banished awaited its return, not through fire, but through midnight, the kind of midnight that cracks open a kingdom. By the following week, the capital smelled of smoke, not the warm kind from bakeries or hearths, but a bitter, biting scent that clung to hair, cloth, and breath. The last of the churches had been razed, their stone skeletons left to be picked apart by wind and silence. Where once bells rang and choirs soared, now only scorched stone and twisted iron remained. Elia stood among the rubble of St. Meryl's chapel, his boots crunching over cinders and bone-white fragments of altar marble. No one was supposed to be here. The soldiers had left at dawn. The ashes were still warm. He knelt down, brushing aside soot until his fingers found a charred remnant of the wooden cross that once hung above the pulpit. It was no longer than a handspan, blackened nearly to coal. But when he pressed it into his palm, a warmth still lived in it. Not heat, exactly, but memory. He wrapped it in cloth, tucked it into the inside of his shirt, and stood, his breath fogged in the morning air, even though it wasn't cold. Back in the palace kitchens, Elia worked in silence, peeling potatoes, stoking fires. He kept his eyes low and his words fewer, but every night, he returned to the same spot in the rubble, where altar met earth, and where something in him refused to die. Others noticed the change. Mira, the young maid, saw how Elia paused before entering rooms, how his hand drifted to his chest as if checking his heartbeat. One night, as she passed him near the cellar steps, she whispered without looking, "You're not the only one." Then she vanished into the dark. Later that week, Elia entered the servants' quarters to find a message scratched into the underside of a table. "He still walks." That night, he lifted a loose floorboard beneath the palace pantry. Carefully, he slid the charred cross beneath it and, around it, placed 4 small stones, one for each of the Gospels. He did not speak. He did not pray aloud. But as he covered it again, something shifted inside him, like breath held too long. Finally exhaled. Meanwhile, in the city, resistance had taken stranger forms. In the northern district, someone carved a tiny cross into the side of a well. By the next morning, it had been painted over, but the next day, it appeared again lower, smaller, subtler. A game of invisible rebellion. Children began to whisper a name they weren't supposed to know, spelling it with their fingers in games of tag, Jesus. The king's soldiers doubled their patrols. Eyes were planted in homes, markets, bakeries. Even the baker who once gave extra bread to hungry mothers was taken away for excessive generosity. The people learned to starve in silence. Still, Elijah kept his secret sanctuary beneath the floorboard. Each day, he passed over it like a priest walking a buried altar. His hands grew more calloused, his face more tired, but his gaze steadier. One evening, Mira appeared at the pantry door with a tattered cloth in hand. "For the floor," she said softly. But when Elijah opened it, he found a broken rosary inside, no longer wearable, but whole enough to remember. "You're not the only one," she repeated. There was no longer a church to meet in, no books to study, no priests to teach. But somehow, faith became sharper in absence, like light in a cave, rare, dim, but piercing. And as midnight approached each night, Elijah began to feel a presence not loud, not visible, but undeniable. In the stillness, in the hush before sleep, there was a waiting. He didn't know what for, only that something was listening, watching, and perhaps preparing. The palace was quiet at night to quiet. Silence used to mean safety, now it felt like surveillance. Walls listened, shadows waited. Footsteps echoed even when no one walked. But beneath the pantry floor, past the boards Elijah lifted with callous care, another world stirred. It began with one voice. An old cook named Rena, who had once baked bread for weddings, began coming to the pantry late, always after the guards changed posts. She didn't speak at first, just stood over the floorboard, eyes closed, lips moving. Not prayer exactly, more like remembering. Then Mira joined. Then two others, Tomas, a gardener with a crooked spine, and Hannah, a seamstress who hadn't spoken in weeks. They brought nothing but silence and shared it like fire. By the end of the month, 6 people gathered under the pantry floor, cramped, breathless, each pressed against stone. They called it the hollow. They didn't dare light candles, so they remembered the Gospels aloud. One would whisper a verse, broken and half recalled, and the others would correct, continue, or simply weep. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." They passed scraps of cloth like relics, each sewn with symbols: a fish, a cross, a crown, tokens of a faith the king thought extinguished. One night, Mira brought a sliver of glass from the ruined chapel window. It was deep red, shaped like a drop of blood. She held it like treasure. Elijah wrapped it in linen and buried it next to the charred cross. "A window still remembers light," she said. Above them, palace guards sharpened spears, unaware of the slow, steady blooming beneath their boots. But danger was never far. One evening, the hollow met his usual low voices, broken verses, knees pressed to stone. But as Elijah rose to leave, he noticed the pantry door was ajar, and not from wind. Outside, a black boot print stained the threshold, large, fresh. The next day, Tomas did not return. No one spoke his name aloud, but when Rena needed bread, her hands trembled. Mira avoided the pantry, and Elijah found a new message carved beneath the table, one voice less. But the word remains. They began rotating meeting times, shuffling entrance patterns, listening twice before knocking. The hollow became not only a sanctuary, but a resistance. Not one of swords or banners, one of breath, memory, and prayer. And somewhere, Elijah began to feel less like a servant and more like a witness. The kind who did not raise his voice, but would not lower his head. Because in the stillness beneath stone, he had heard something. Not a voice, not yet, but a whisper, a stirring in the soul that felt older than kings and deeper than silence. And it said, "Hold on." Whispers were no longer safe. The king's decree had done more than ban the cross that had bred suspicion into the walls. Servants no longer shared jokes. Families dined in silence. Children learned to speak with their eyes, not their tongues. A kingdom that once sung now barely breathed. And the worst of it wasn't the soldiers. It was the eyes. They were no armor, bore no banners. They could be anyone: a butcher's apprentice, a man sweeping the palace steps, even a toothless beggar slumped near the fountain. No one knew how many there were, only that when they appeared, someone disappeared. One day, Rena the cook came to the hollow with blood on her sleeve. Not hers, Tomas's. She had found a scrap of his shirt behind the stable, torn and marked with rope. She didn't cry. She only placed it beside the sliver of stained glass and whispered, "He didn't break." That night, the hollow held its breath. No prayers, no verses, only the sound of fists clenched in grief. Outside, the king's palace glittered. Lights burned late into the night. Alador was preparing for something more: executions, perhaps, or a new edict. Rumors swirled like smoke, but within the kitchens, something darker brewed. A young stable boy Kel was caught humming an old hymn while grooming horses. Within an hour, he was gone. No trial, no body, only a broom leaning against the stable wall, in silence where laughter used to be. Then, it happened. Elijah was summoned. A royal steward appeared in the kitchen mid-morning, his hands white-gloved, his face unreadable. "The king requires your service." Elijah nodded, blood draining from his face. He wiped his hands, removed his apron, and followed. They led him not to the throne room, but to a side corridor he'd never entered before. The halls were narrow, windowless. The only sound was the ticking of a small iron clock. He was brought before a long table. Behind it sat 3 men, not nobles, not guards, something colder. Their robes were gray, not the soot-stained gray of laborers, but a precise, intentional shade, like ash chosen deliberately. One spoke. "Elijah of the lower kitchens, do you know what heresy looks like?" He said nothing. The man continued. "It begins as a whisper, a name passed between loaves, a symbol scratched into wood, a memory that does not forget." Elijah's heart thudded. The second man leaned in. "You worked with Rena." It wasn't a question. "You served the chapel before it burned." Elijah stared at the wall. "You were seen, Elijah, in the pantry. You removed something from the rubble." Still, he said nothing. But then the third man, silent until now, slid something across the table. A cloth-wrapped object. Elijah knew before unwrapping it. The charred piece of the cross. They had found it, or someone had given it to them. And yet, what Elijah feared most was not the punishment, but the betrayal. Someone in the hollow had spoken. The gray-robed man leaned close. "You have one chance. Speak the names. Give us the others." Elijah looked down at the blackened wood, the symbol he had carried near his heart for weeks. He thought of Tomas, gagged and bleeding, of Mira, stitching prayers into scraps, of the hollow, barely holding on beneath the weight of silence. He met the man's gaze. "I cook potatoes." Silence. "I scrub pans. I fetch water. I say nothing." A pause. Then, "Very well." They let him go, but as he left the room, he knew nothing would ever be the same. By the time he returned to the kitchens, the floorboard in the pantry had been ripped out, the hollow exposed, empty. Mira was gone, and on the wall, carved with deliberate precision, were 3 words: "He still walks." The air in Viral had shifted. It no longer carried the weight of silence, it reeked of smoke and fear. By now, the hollow had scattered. The floorboard sanctuary was gone, its members disappeared, relocated, or worse. Elijah still worked in the kitchens, still chopped roots and boiled broth, but he no longer tasted anything. Everything was ash, everything was loss. Then came the midwife. Her name was Sister Anedria, once known simply as Annie to the poor in the outer districts. She had delivered half the city's children. Her hands had caught more life than most priests had blessed. Wrinkled and gentle, her voice always carried calm, even when mothers screamed. She had no family, only the city and the cross. Rumors started first. A girl had whispered a prayer while giving birth. Said Annie told her he hears you, and then traced a cross on the child's brow with oil. The guards heard, or someone made sure they did. Within days, Anedria was dragged into the central square. It wasn't done in secret. No, this was a message. Elijah stood at the edge of the growing crowd. The soldiers formed a circle of spears, forcing civilians to watch. Mira was gone. Tomas was gone. Rena hadn't returned in days. But now Annie, this kind old woman, was bound at the wrists, standing over a pile of dried logs. The king didn't appear. He never did. He didn't have to. A herald read the charge: spiritual sedition, unauthorized anointing, invocation of a forbidden name. And then he read the punishment: purification by flame. A hush fell. No trial, no appeal, no mercy. The torch was lit. Elijah couldn't move. He couldn't scream, but he watched as the flame caught the edges of her robe, as the smoke climbed into the pale morning sky, as the last whisper she uttered vanished beneath the crackle of firewood. But it wasn't silence, because someone, in the crowd, began to hum, low, soft, a melody older than the king's line. A hymn not sung in public since the decree. Then another joined. And another. Eliah's own voice rose before he realized it, shaky, off-key, but present. The guards shouted. The herald barked orders. But the humming grew. It was not loud, but it was unified. Dozens of citizens, eyes wet, voices locked, all watching the fire, all refusing to forget. And in that moment, the king failed. He had burned a body, but he had lit a song. After the execution, Eliah walked alone to the far edge of the city, to the old well where crosses used to be carved. It was painted over, of course, but someone had etched new words beneath it. She birthed children. And faith. He pressed his hand against the stone and whispered, she didn't burn alone. That night, he dreamed of a woman walking through smoke barefoot, holding a crying child, leaving no ashes where her feet touched. 2 weeks passed. The city of Viral returned to stillness. But it was no longer the quiet of fear, it was the quiet after a wound, deep and aching, not yet scabbed. Sister Anedria's death had become a phantom shadow. People passed the square where she had burned and looked away. No one spoke her name, but everyone felt her absence. Eliah kept working in the kitchens, day after day. Routine was now armor. Then came the child. It was late afternoon when she appeared barefoot, dirt smudged, maybe 6 years old. Eliah found her crouched near the back entrance of the palace, hiding behind crates of stale bread. Her eyes were wide, brown, and oddly calm. He crouched. Are you lost? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed him something wrapped in rough linen. He opened it. A small wooden cross, no longer than a finger, carved from olive wood. Its edges were smooth, but the lines were etched with care. At the center was a small notch, like a drop, as if the one who carved it had meant for it to bleed. Who gave this to you? Eliah asked. The child tilted her head. A lady. She said you need it. Eliah stared. The girl pointed to his chest. She said you were the one who remembers. Before he could ask more, she turned and walked away down the alley, through the slats of a closing gate. By the time he chased after her, she was gone. He looked back at the cross. It was warm in his hand. That night, he buried it beside the others, the charred fragment, the sliver of stained glass, Tomas's torn cloth, the broken rosary. He no longer thought of it as hiding. It was an altar. He whispered into the floor, not knowing if anyone heard. If she's still watching, then I'll still wait. But peace would not stay. The next morning, Eliah found a mark scratched into the inside of his pantry door. A crude symbol, half sun, half flame. He had seen it once before, on the binding of a banned book confiscated from the chapel's library. It was a warning. By nightfall, the palace gates were closed. Guards moved with more urgency. The usual eyes now wore blades. Whispers said the king had been disturbed during his evening ritual, claimed to have heard chanting from the stone walls. Eliah didn't believe it at first. But then, 2 soldiers barged into the kitchen and began searching barrels. One kicked over a crate of dried figs and shouted, "They're hiding signs again. The heresy's crawling back." That night, Eliah returned to the pantry and lifted the floorboard. Everything was gone. The charred cross, the glass shard, the cloth, the rosary. Only a single word remained, carved where the altar once was. Soon, he fell to his knees, not in despair, in preparation, because something was changing, not just inside him but in the air, the soil, the pulse of the palace. It was subtle, but it was building, and whatever it was, it would not stay hidden much longer. The city of Viral had always known the sound of wind rustling cloaks, swaying church spires, moaning through alleyways like ghosts with nowhere left to haunt. But on that night, not even the leaves moved. There was no breeze, no distant owl. Even the bells of the watchtower, usually clanging every hour, remained silent. Eliah noticed it first while boiling water in the kitchens. The flames from the stove rose straight up. No flicker, no sway. Something unnatural had settled. He stepped outside. Every breath of the night air felt heavier, still, as if the city itself were holding something in its lungs. Then the singing began. It was faint at first, almost like wind pretending to be a voice. But then it grew stronger, layered harmonies, slow and ancient, as if sung through stone in memory. It was a hymn, a real one, not the empty chants the king's priest rehearsed, but a hymn older than Viral's walls, older than the kingdom's map. Eliah followed the sound. He crept through side corridors of the palace, passing darkened halls where tapestries shifted without breeze. The hymn pulled him like a thread, down, down, into the cellar levels where wine used to be stored before the king converted them into archives. At the bottom of the spiral stairwell, he found the source. A woman in white, not dressed in silk, but in linen simple, radiant in the candlelight that surrounded her. Her face was veiled, and her arms outstretched over a stone table. She wasn't alone. There were 6 others in a circle, some in servant robes, others in cloaks defined for commoners, all of them singing in unity. He froze, not out of fear, but out of recognition. One of them, an older man with a crooked shoulder, was the baker who sold bread to the guards. Another was the gatekeeper's daughter. And the third, Elia, almost staggered, was General Saron, the king's own war strategist. The white-cloaked woman turned. Though her face remained veiled, her voice was clear. "We have been waiting for you." Elia stepped forward, barely breathing. "Who are you? What you thought was gone," she said, "was only sleeping. We are what remains. And you are the key." He shook his head. "I'm no one, you remembered," said another in the circle, "when no one else dared. You buried light beneath floors others feared to walk." The stone table between them was not an altar. It was a map etched in silver and ash, a design of virile as it once was, when faith had shaped every gate and road. The veiled woman spoke again. "Tonight is the last night of silence. Tomorrow, the king will hold the midnight proclamation. He will declare himself the living God." Elia's chest tightened. "If he speaks those words over the people," the general said, "then the spell of fear will be sealed for another generation. Unless," the veiled woman added, "someone speaks truth over him first." Elia looked down at the map. There was a mark at the center beneath the palace throne room. "A forgotten chamber, a sealed sanctuary. You must go there," she said. "You must say the name." He knew the name. He had heard it in the hymn, had seen it in Sister Enedria's ashes, had felt it carved in the child's cross. A name the king had banned. A name once sung at every birth and whispered at every death. He didn't speak it aloud, but it filled his chest like flame. And for the first time in years, he felt no fear, only clarity. Tomorrow, at midnight, the king would speak before the crowd, but Elia would already be beneath him, waiting. The palace was a creature of masks, grand halls veiled in marble, corridors pretending to be empty, and stairs that led to nowhere unless you knew the truth. But beneath it all lay something older than the throne it upheld, a secret carved in silence. At sunrise, Elia stood in the eastern wing, hands stained with ink and dust. The false wall behind the tapestry just beneath the mural of the king's supposed divine lineage opened with pressure applied to a single chipped brick. Inside, the passage breathed cold. The stone narrowed, forcing him to walk sideways, torch in one hand, the child's hidden cross in the other. Each step echoed with memories not his own. Screams, songs, chains falling, prayers ending mid-syllable. This was where the first bishops were slaughtered, where believers once took shelter when the empire marched on virile centuries before it became a kingdom. He reached a gate of rusted iron. No lock, just wait. He pushed. The chamber opened like a wound. It was circular, built with black stone veined in silver. At its center was a dais, and around it, 12 empty niches carved into the wall once holding statues, now stripped clean by fear. The only thing that remained, an inscription on the floor, still faintly glowing in the dark. "Truth does not kneel." Elia stepped inside. The moment he did, the torch went out. No wind, no movement, just light emerging from beneath the stone, as if the floor remembered him. He knelt, not to pray, but to prepare. Tonight, the king would stand above this chamber. Tonight, the proclamation would echo through the marble, and when it did, Elia would speak the name, the real one. He didn't know what would happen. He didn't expect a miracle. But when the cross touched the center of the floor, the days shifted. Risen by unseen gears, it revealed a hidden cavity no larger than a book, wrapped in cloth. He opened it. It was a page from the original text one of the lost scrolls Sister Enedria had once whispered about. Not copied, not retold. The real scripture, inked in the blood of martyrs, buried when the king's ancestors began rewriting faith into law. At its center, the name written in a dialect that predated language. And just below it, instructions. Not commands, not spells, just truth spoken as it was meant to be heard. If you speak the name where he claims the crown, all lies above will fall down. Elia memorized every stroke. By nightfall, the city stirred like a stage being prepared. Flags rose, horns blared. The king's decree spread like wildfire, all citizens to gather at the high plaza. Midnight, no exceptions. Above ground, the throne room filled with nobles, soldiers, and the desperate who came to beg blessings. Below, Elia waited in the dark. He wasn't alone. From the tunnel behind him, others stepped in cloaked figures from the hymn circle. They said nothing. They only took their places in the niches. 12 of them, like missing pieces, returned to the wall. Each held a candle. Each stood in silence. When the final bell struck midnight, a voice rang out from the throne room above. The king, on this night, the stars bend to my will, he declared. On this night, the gods recognized their successor, Elias stood. The chamber trembled faintly. On this night the king's voice swelled. I become the living word. And from below, a whisper rose, not shouted, spoken, clear, quiet, certain. You are not the word, you are its shadow. The floor above cracked like thin ice. Gasps, screams, and then the sound of something breaking, not stone, illusion, as if the spell cast by centuries of lies had finally been spoken against. The days glowed. The hidden scripture rose with heat. The name burned silently in every mind that heard it, even if their ears didn't know what had been said. And above, the king fell silent, not dead, but silenced, paralyzed by something no sword could cut. Truth. The days glowed. The hidden scripture rose with heat. The name burned silently in every mind that heard it, even if their ears didn't know what had been said. And above, the king fell silent, not dead, but silenced, paralyzed by something no sword could cut. Truth. High above, stained glass windows shuddered in their frames. The great spire of the cathedral adjacent to the palace let out a low, aching groan as though the stone itself was remembering something it had been forced to forget. And then came the crack, not loud, but precise, a sound like old wood giving way under truth. The throne split straight down its center, clean, symmetrical, and final. No hammer, no hands, just the breaking of a lie too long sustained. Elias stood in the chamber beneath, the hidden scroll still clutched to his chest. His whisper had traveled through stone and shadow, carving a path where armies had failed. Above him, the trembling floor gave way to light, thin, golden threads leaking down like rays from a sun buried beneath guilt. From the 12 niches, the cloaked figures raised their candles high. The flame did not burn upward, it burned outward, as if drawn toward the breach. And in that moment, the people above, those who had knelt, those who had cursed, those who had merely come to survive, felt it to shift, not in power, but in reality. There is still heard silence, but their hearts pounded with a rhythm they hadn't known since childhood, a memory of something more, something holy. The king staggered back, his voice, once sharp as decree, now barely rasped. What have you done? He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was pleading with a presence, a force he had denied for years, now manifest without form, a presence that did not answer in thunder, but simply remained. There is still heard silence, but their hearts pounded with a rhythm they hadn't known since childhood, a memory of something more, something holy. The king staggered back, his voice, once sharp as decree, now barely rasped. What have you done? He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was pleading with a presence, a force he had denied for years, now manifest without form, a presence that did not answer in thunder, but simply remained. Lady Caldretta, one of the royal seers, dropped to her knees, her jeweled circlet clattering to the marble floor. She wept not from fear, but from a strange relief. Others followed, not in blind obedience, but because something inside them recognized the shift, recognized him, the one whose name had finally been spoken again. Below, Elia collapsed to one knee. The scroll pulsed with heat, then dimmed, its purpose fulfilled. It would no longer burn, no longer whisper. It had passed its truth into the world, and now, that world would choose what to do with it. Footsteps approached behind him, not hurried, not cautious. Sister Anedria. She had emerged from the other tunnel, one Elia didn't even know existed. Her veil was gone, her face lined, but calm. She carried no weapon, only a small brass vial filled with oil consecrated before the first temple was ever built. She poured it slowly around the days, tracing the circle with reverent care. Then she spoke for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. He's not dead. Elia looked up. The king? She shook her head. The true king, the one you summoned with the name. Above them, the sound of movement returned. Not panic. Steps. Measured. Intentional. The palace guards were parting not by order, but by instinct. No one told them to move, but move they did, as though making way for something they could not explain. A child entered the throne room, the same child who had once drawn the cross on his skin in the dirt. He looked no different, but every eye followed him. The guards did not block his way. He stepped forward, past the broken throne, and turned to face the crowd. And though he said nothing, they understood. He carried no scepter, no robe, only presence. And across the city, bells rang not by hand, but by wind, as if the sky itself had given its nod. Below, Anedria lit the oil. The chamber flared with gold, revealing murals hidden for centuries, images of the lamb, the tree, the wound, and the crown, not as decoration, but as remembrance. Elias stood in the center of it all, heart still pounding. "What now?" he asked. Anedria didn't answer. She only nodded toward the stone archway now glowing at the far end of the chamber. The gate had opened, not a metaphor, a real gate, and from it, the sound of waters rushing, of songs once silenced, humming again with impossible harmony. He stepped forward, not as a rebel, not as a prophet, but as someone who had carried the truth long enough, and finally let it walk on its own. The gate stood open, silent, patient, glowing with a light that did not blind, but beckoned. Elia crossed its threshold without hesitation. Behind him, Sister Anedria followed, her pace steady, as though she had walked this path many times in dreams. No stone closed behind them, no trumpet sounded. It was not a fairy tale ending, nor a dramatic climax. It was something simpler, holier, a beginning. The chamber gave way to a corridor carved from smooth white stone, lined with ivy that should not have grown in the darkness, and at the end of it a field, wide, unfenced, sunlit, untouched. It stretched on into the horizon, and in the center of the field stood a tree. The same tree Elia had seen in visions, etched on scroll margins and whispered about in forbidden prayers, the tree of covenant, unmarked by seasons, bearing fruit not of hunger, but of promise. Around it, people were gathering, not summoned, not dragged. They came because they heard the call in their bones. Former soldiers, silenced priests, mothers, runaways, those the kingdom had exiled in silence. Each arrived not to take, but to remember. The boy was already there. He sat beneath the tree, drawing circles in the earth with his finger, calm, expectant. And when he looked up, the air itself paused as though creation waited to inhale. He spoke no words, yet each heart heard the same thing. This is not the end. This is where truth lives freely. Far away, the palace remained, but the throne room was empty. The king had disappeared, some say fled, others say collapsed in the courtyard, finally seeing the cross drawn in shadow on every tile he had stepped upon. The throne was never rebuilt, nor was it missed. Instead, people began to gather in homes, gardens, abandoned temples, not in hiding, but in hope. The name that had once been forbidden became a whisper again, then a greeting, then a hymn. Children painted crosses without fear. The scrolls, once hidden, were copied and passed hand to hand, not to incite rebellion, but remembrance. In time, no one could remember who had first broken the silence. And that was good, because the truth no longer needed a name behind it. It had become the air they breathed. Elia lived in the outer hills, near the wellspring where the gate had opened. He built no monument, refused titles, spoke only when asked, but he smiled often. And when strangers asked him, did it really happen? Did the throne truly crack? He would look up, as though listening, and answer gently, no, it didn't crack. It was hollow all along. We just finally heard it ring. And the boy, some say he aged, others say he didn't, but always, he remained near the tree. And every once in a while, when someone asked what made him stay, he would lift his eyes and say, because this is where he walks. And in the distance, wind would move through the grass in the shape of a cross.